Um, Before starting this talk, I would like to remind you that this session will be recorded. And once again, thank you all so much for coming today. Professor Bose, please, when you wish.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for inviting me. It's like a real pleasure to talk to students on a just sort of personal note, which I don't get to do sometimes when I'm teaching. So that's really great. I thought that I could actually start by speaking a little bit about my work and what I do and kind of my research. And I created a PowerPoint for this just to sort of give you some images of, the things that I'm thinking through and just the puzzles, the political problems or political science puzzles that I'm thinking through. And then I thought I could talk a little bit about how I sort of got there, how I arrived there through college and actually kind of starting in high school probably. So let me just share with you this PowerPoint. Okay, so it's disabled screen sharing. You can just make me host for a second there.
Oh, just give me 1 second. I don't know how to do that. 1 second, Professor. For one reason, I don't have the option here.
Okay.
No, I don't have the option.
Okay, that's okay. I can just sort of talk about my research. So, so I guess what I think about a lot in my work is whether or not it's possible to enact collective political action on a global scale, and what are the kind of resources we need to enact collective global action, right? How do we sort of like build out and breathe life into core political ideals like solidarity in order to generate collective action at the global scale? I guess today more than ever, our problems transcend national borders, right? And so this has become even more clear with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, to the climate crisis, obviously, and it's clear from the way that we're dealing with the pandemic that we really have quite impoverished political resources to handle a public health concern of that scale, right? So our institutions are weak, our political imaginations are narrow, and really, this is the real problem. I think that both at the global scale, we just don't have the capacity to take action, to pressing and urgent global problems. So I guess then the problem to me is, how do we broaden our imaginations and think beyond narrow confines of the present, right? Where it seems that acting and thinking beyond the local and even the national community is really something that seems very challenging. And one of the ways to, I think about this predicament is to actually consider historical eras that were opening up the possibility of collective action and the politics of solidarity at that global international scale. What are the other kind of transformative events in history where people sought to restructure global institutions and also restructure these global frameworks of power, right? And so in my work, I turn to the era of decolonization in the mid-20th century, between 1945 and 1960 approximately, right? And so this was a world historical moment. It was a very important historical juncture where really like new forms of collective politics was emerging at the global level to transform the structure of imperialism that had defined the world for centuries at that point, right? So so the imperialism had structured the international system for approximately 2 centuries, and really it wasn't just about national liberation. It was also about, well, how do we think about political institutions like the United Nations? How do we restructure it so that newly independent nations can have power in these international institutions? So decolonization, like I was saying, was this world historical moment of crisis and transformation, and a large proportion of the masses in colonized and newly decolonized nations had this deep sense of possibility that it was, possible, that it was possible to shape the world, and to address this problem that the famous African American thinker W.E.B. Du Bois called the problem of the color line, right? And this is the world had until then been structured through process of extraction, dispossession, and colonization between Europe and its colonies. And W.E.B. Du Bois famously called this the problem of the color line. He really kind of racialized this problem, which it was. And so why I say that is because by saying the problem of the color line, he wasn't just talking about national liberation, but he was talking about this sort of global problem of inequality that was going to restructure the world in the 20th century and the 21st century, and that it was necessary to kind of respond. And even the kind of ongoing challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic are really kind of sort of permutations of that problem, right? It's not a coincidence that vaccines are not accessible to many countries of the global South, and that there continue to be challenges to get vaccines to countries in the global South, and these variants keep emerging, and so on, right? So we just don't have a way to coordinate collective action at that scale, and we just don't even have the political ideals that would allow us to do that. And so I guess what I do here, is I'm writing a book. And so I'm writing a book about a political thinker whose name is Frantz Fanon. And he was he was a Afro-Caribbean, but he was very active in decolonization struggles in northern and sub-Saharan Africa. And what I do is I really think through his text. He was definitely, a political thinker, but he was also a psychiatrist, a physician. And so I think through a range of political writing, psychiatric writing, psychoanalytic writings, and I think through how, in being immersed in the struggle for liberation in Algeria, he was not just thinking about Algeria, he was thinking about the continent of Africa, but also beyond the continent of Africa to the international and really to the global South. Like, he was articulating this idea of a tricontinental sphere of political action for the global South. And, I really try and reconstruct by reading his work how he was imagining that kind of internationalism that I call tricontinentalism between Africa, Asia, and Latin America as this sort of framework of institutions, right? He was imagining institutions, but he was also trying to sort of rethink this ideal of solidarity. And, he's thinking about it as a concrete practice, not that really the masses, like ordinary people are engaged in. And what does it mean to actually be in solidarity with those who are not your compatriots, right? Like who are not your national compatriots. And he has this sort of, on a very, very sort of kind of, I guess, in the sort of most pithiest and sort of summarized version, it is an account of solidarity that is not charity, right? It's where you are acting with others who are in need. And so it's really kind of acting with and for others, as opposed to sort of giving resources, so to speak, right? And so in the sort of most kind of, I guess, down to earth terms, that's how I would sort of capture his ideal. And so So there's two sort of things there. He's on the one hand giving us the structure of a tricontinental institutions for the global, a set of institutions for the global South, and he's sort of imagining that. And he's also offering us a distinct account of solidarity. And so those are sort of like the two aspects of Fanon's writings that I try and really sort of interpretively amplify in my work. And I guess returning to Frantz Fanon today, really, and this moment where we have this kind of crisis of collective politics or inability to sort of really act at that collective scale, to respond to environmental, economic, political problems that are planetary in scale and impact. Rereading Fanon today, it sort of lets us think, it sort of pushes us beyond the limit of our possibility and, to other kinds of horizons that were imagined at this sort of historical opening in the mid-20th century. And so I do think that returning to thinkers in that moment of, decolonization really sort of both helps to illuminate our current challenges, but also things about kind of potential, within those challenges that arise. So broadly, that's kind of what I am writing this book about. It's a huge and challenging process to write a book. But part of what we do as professors is teach you and get, very stimulated and excited by your ideas. But also at the same time, we have to kind of return to this very solitary work where we don't get to kind of talk to you all the time and be alone with our books and be in the archives for hours and hours and hours. And you have to kind of like that and enjoy that. It is a lonely process, but it can also be kind of satisfying if you're into that, I guess. And so, and I think the way that I sort of got to this point, I had no interest in being a professor. I was a very sort of pragmatic person. I started school wanting to be a reporter, an investigative reporter. I started doing a Bachelor of journalism, actually, as an undergraduate in Canada, in British Columbia. And but I always had, even in high school, I got mobilized thinking through kind of questions of asylum and sort of refugees and displacement. I grew up actually in Australia. Well, sort of, I did my high school in Australia for some time. And so, I don't know if you're aware, but Australia has this pretty kind of draconian policies around asylum and detention of refugees. So I kind of, as a high school student, I just kind of got mobilized and became politically active, thinking about the refugee crisis and how that really seem to question, the real problems that we have with just our borders and how, like, human rights, specifically the right to seek asylum, which is a fundamental human right, are constantly undercut by the enforcement of national borders. And so it seemed to me like a real contradiction while I was sort of going to political protests at detention centers in Australia and so on. It kind of made me want to have a more practical career working with the UNHCR or becoming a journalist. I was reporting on this, and I started a Bachelor of Journalism. I did not ever think that I would be doing sort of the work of a political philosopher or political theorist. But, I got drawn into it. Like, I took political theory courses, and it seemed to somehow satisfy my desire to think about these issues on a very deep and foundational level. Like, what are the kind of like core sort of problems here? How do we think about these questions in a foundational way? So the question of asylum seekers, for instance, like I said, I feel like there were some important kinds of contradictions that seemed to not be addressed by UNHCR or even by at the national level. So political theory sort of helped me investigate sort of settled and sedimented political concepts such as state sovereignty, and even just the sort of scope and scale of human rights. And those kind of like unearthing and kind of sort of unraveling those kind of inherited and assumed political concepts was really stimulating to me, and I was encouraged to do a PhD. I didn't listen to anybody. I thought I was too young to do a PhD right after college, and so I just kind of traveled around Asia and taught English in Japan, and just did whatever I wanted. And then eventually I was like, I don't want a corporate job teaching CEOs in Japan how to speak English. So I'm going to go back to grad school. And so that's what I did. UCLA was a good place to do this because of the proximity of the US-Mexico border. And it's just, California is this incredible laboratory for thinking about these questions of state sovereignty and the limitations of state sovereignty. It was a good grad program. There were obviously a lot of challenges, not as much as perhaps doing grad school during a pandemic, but yeah, there are a lot of very important and significant people there that I got a lot of good mentoring from. And yeah, I mean, I think I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the sort of solitary nature of the work. And eventually, it got me to Minnesota, and here I am in the Midwest. So yeah, that's sort of the long journey to how I got here.
It's an amazing journey. Hello, everybody, the new people here. Hey, so Professor, maybe we can start with some questions from students, and
Sure.
then just keep talking and talking. So please, you just show your hand and we can start. Becky.
Yes. Hi, Becky. Sure.
Hi. I always have questions. I'm so curious about maybe anything that you kind of did, either got involved in research or an internship or something that you did as an undergrad that stood out and helped you kind of figure out your way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wrote for the university newspaper. It was like a really important sort of space for me to find like-minded peers and just sort of have a political space for me to kind of think at the local, like sort of at the university level. And also, at the time, it was a great place for me to kind of report on students who were involved in like protests and, at the time, the war in Iraq and so on. So that was really important for me. I didn't do actually any internships because I had intended to, because I sort of wanted to work in the NGO sort of field, and then got sidetracked doing more sort of political theory kind of courses. So I didn't do that. I had a sense of the importance of doing that if I wanted to go on the track of working, let's say, with the UNHCR at some point and building up that resume. But I didn't pursue that. And really, yeah, I think writing for the college newspaper was really important for me. I did work as an RA for one of my professors one summer, and I helped her with her book manuscript that she was working on, and sort of that was kind of interesting because it gave me some insight into what wasn't, like, she was very young. She was sort of like a junior assistant professor at the time. And it gave me some insight into sort of what was involved at the time, where she wasn't doing a lot of things digitally, in just sort of collecting, all the kind of archival materials, and really just having this sort of really, I guess, very structured and organizational type of mind. And I mean, with having, if she had done all of that on a computer, it would have been much easier. But she had just kind of scanned and organized things in hindsight. But yeah, like just kind of, helping her go through her filing cabinets and organizing things. And so that gave me some insight into what was involved. And, she just sort of talked to me about her own writing process and sort of how she struggled with writing, struggling with writing block, and all of the sort of aspects that are kind of, that can be a really terrifying if you're writing a book and you have writing block for like a year or something. So, she just sort of like helped me think through those challenges as normal. And she's actually a graduate of the University of Minnesota from like 2000, I think 2001 or something. So way back in the day. So that she was really just starting when she came to UBC in Canada. So, and she's obviously delighted that I am teaching at her graduate school in her alma mater. But yeah. Yeah, Brindavani, yes. Oh, I think I'm having some trouble hearing you, actually.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I had a question about what your research process and like kind of writing process looks like, because taking on a book is such like how you talked about it, a really intimidating and like kind of big task. And I was just wondering how you approach that. And then also, like, what methods do you think that college students, or from your experience teaching, what college students can implement more in their research process as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my writing process is, I always start with kind of a skeleton or some kind of scaffolding of an outline, and I fill it out. I'm a very linear writer, so I start with the introduction, and it's pretty much like, fully a fleshed out introduction, and I just like keep going, and I write and write and write, and by the time I'm at my in conclusion, it's done. Other people have different methods, like they sometimes sort of start with in the middle and kind of build out in a web-like manner, and kind of edit. But for me, I edit while I write, and so by the time it's done, it is the most polished work that I imagine it's going to be. But part of that is because I'm starting with a pretty filled out scaffolding, and it really, I have a clear sense of the structure in my mind. And the other thing that I do is something that actually one of my mentors taught me, called the paper trail, which is when you're working on a large project like this, not the paper trail, the breadcrumbs method, which is that when you so a chapter is, let's say, a chapter is approximately about 15,000 words or so. It's about, 45, 50 pages, double spaced. And so it's like a big project, right? And that's one chapter in my book of 4 substantive chapters and an intro and a conclusion. So it's a large project. So, when you leave for the day, you kind of leave some breadcrumbs behind so that you have a sense of exactly where to return. So I kind of write pretty detailed notes of how I'm going to return, because part of the problem with working on these large projects is that you waste some time the next day, so, returning to the project, like, wait, what did I write? Like, where did I leave off? And so that kind of helps me a lot. So this kind of scaffolding and the breadcrumbs method is very helpful. I also, I'm in the interpretive humanities or interpretive social sciences, whatever you want to call it. So I don't do historical or archival work, but I do have to, offer a new interpretation of this thinker. It's a single thinker project on Frantz Fanon. So there's a lot of kind of creativity and originality that is required. It also means like mastering everything that has ever been said about Frantz Fanon in, since his death, right? And so there, I need to kind of create a system of note taking where I can really sort of have a clear sense of the sort of gist of what someone is saying, because what you're doing with a project like mine is you're like staging an intervention and saying, hey, look, readings, sort of reading public on Frantz Fanon, literary sort of public on Frantz Fanon, like you all have not noticed this, but like if we read Fanon in this sort of in this way that is closely attuned to his historical context, we realize that there are all of these kind of new valences to his work that we have not otherwise unearthed. And so staging that intervention means knowing really well what other people have said, and that means having really good notes of what others have said. In terms of undergraduate writing, I would say that, working on especially like honors thesis or like a longer research project like that, I would say definitely, outlining is very important, and kind of fleshing out that outline and giving yourself like really concrete tasks. Okay, like tomorrow I'm going to return and I'm going to sort of flesh out this author, and I'm going to then bring in this key research data that I brought in, and I'm going to link it to this particular secondary literature so giving yourself really detailed instructions of what to do the next day, it just sort of makes it more like a task, as opposed to kind of like sitting there and like, what do I do next? And what do I say next? So that kind of breaking it down into these sort of small tasks makes it a much more manageable project. So a manageable writing project.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And like, just from taking your course last semester, I found myself doing the same thing kind of for the papers as well, where, especially because we had to go really dive deep into various authors, just kind of being specific in terms of like a to-do list of like, oh, I'm going to specifically look into this, and like something within that as well. And then I have one more question if no one else wants to go right now, but I was wondering like what specific work or like what gave you the introduction into Frantz Fanon? Like why did you choose them? Like was there a specific instance or like a moment?
Yeah, so I read Fanon as an undergraduate, and his writing is very, it's very fiery and evocative and really kind of jumps off the page and really sort of draws you in. So as an undergraduate, I was just kind of drawn to the writing. But I also, as a graduate student, I didn't know right away what my dissertation was going to be about. It took me maybe about like 2.5 years to figure out what I was going to write about. And so we had these reading groups that I did with others in my cohort, where we just sort of got together and, in a coffee shop and just read books. And we were reading Fanon's works. And it's sort of just like, as we were reading and discussing it, and as I was reading and discussing it sort of like 4 years later after college, I was like, I think there's a project here. And also I think that I can, like, I feel like I felt close to the project. Like I felt like I could stay with it. Do you know what I mean? Like a dissertation was going to then be sort of transformed into a book. And I felt like I needed a project that I could be reading and like sort of turning over in my head and researching and expanding and writing and revising and all of those processes. Like I really did think that on the one hand, there were some core insights in his work that needed to be amplified, but also I felt like I could stick with it. Like I could keep reading Fanon and still be getting new insights. And when I teach him, that's what I feel like. When I teach him every time, I feel like there's something new that didn't occur to me, so it just feels like this wellspring of insights, and that made me feel like this was what I wanted to do. It took some convincing, to my advisors really needed to be convinced that I could write this whole project on this one thinker, and but they relented. So yeah.
Is there a big literature on him, like, or is that a difficulty for you?
Yeah, there's a huge literature on him. He's widely read, and he's had this sort of he's traveled through different disciplines like post-colonial studies, comparative literature, Africana studies, now Black studies, increasingly political theory, political philosophy now as well. So, and every sort of, and every decade since his death in 1961 has produced like a different interpretation of him, and depending on the kind of political moment at the time. He's also kind of just widely read in social movements. So, for instance, he was read by the Black Panthers. He was read in indigenous sovereignty movements, and so there's this sort of way in which he didn't just travel in the academy, but really was, his texts were these sort of treatises for thinking about decolonization in North America as well. I mean, thinking through settler colonialism especially. So another reason I think that I was drawn to it, that it wasn't just like something that was circulating in the ivory tower, but had this real life and in social movements. So yeah.
Professor, I know this is too late, but now you can share your screen. I'm sorry.
Oh, well, it's okay now. I just sort of talked through the slides. So.
Sorry. It took me a while. Sorry. So more questions.
I have another question.
Yeah.
I'm always trying to think of the things that students ask me, right? So one of the questions that I would like to ask you is, do you ever work with undergraduate students? And if so, how would you best want them to approach you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I'm working with an undergraduate student for the first time this semester. And so it's a kind of independent directed study that we're doing together. And I think that, I'm sort of still working out the details of this, but, she was really passionate about this project. She wanted to study the way in which critical race theory has become politicized in education. And I think if you approach me with sort of the bare outlines of a project, I most likely would ask you to give me a little bit more of a detailed project proposal. So I would kind of ask you to elaborate a little bit more, which is what I asked her to do. And also it's part of, kind of one of the forms where she has to do that anyway. So, and then we would kind of work out how really like what the major project is. And she wanted it to be kind of like a large sort of 10 to 15 page paper. We're sort of working out the specifics of that, and really kind of what she wants to get out of it, and what are the sort of literatures that she wants to read. So a lot of it in this case with the directed reading has been really initiated by her, and I have asked her to kind of elaborate a little bit more here and elaborate on her project proposal here, and kind of I've guided her a bit more in her secondary literature. So that's sort of how I would, I think, probably push you to kind of elaborate if you were to approach me with kind of the bare outlines of a project. Yeah. Yeah. Daniela, did you have that question?
Yes, I have a question. So why Minnesota? Why this university? What did you find here?
Oh, right. So in terms of coming here for the job, yeah. Well, I mean, so the University of Minnesota has a really good contingent of political theorists. Like, it has a reputation for always having a solid political theory program. Like I said, my undergraduate mentors, both of them graduated from here. At the time, I was like, I didn't know anything about which were the good political theory programs or anything like that. But, it typically has had historically has always had a very supportive and strong political theory program. And so that's always good, you know, when you're starting as a junior scholar and Scott faculty member. And so that definitely attracted me. When I gave my job talk here, you know, I got really good questions, and I felt like really sort of, I guess I felt like the sort of faculty and students were on my wavelength, like they were sort of asking me questions that were pushing me, but at the same time kind of grasped some of the core questions that I was thinking about. I was also sort of attracted to what's one of the sort of initiatives that Daniela is aware of, which is the graduate sort of core called the Power Equity Diversity Program. That is an initiative to kind of think about the history of political science as a field, and, you know, how is it demographically shifting in terms of embracing sort of a more diverse demographic, both in terms of students and faculty. And I think that kind of sort of self-awareness that is being cultivated at Minnesota really sort of drew me in, because, yeah, I mean, political science hasn't like historically been a discipline where you can study questions of race and gender and, you know, class inequality in ways that are really kind of challenging structures of power. And so thinking a bit more about why that has been the case and making a concerted effort to do that, I think, was attractive to me. I came out of a program where there was a subfield that was attempting to do that in a very sort of nascent way. So, and I benefited from that kind of critical orientation to political science. So, so yeah, I think that definitely was part of it. Yeah. Yes, Kelso?
Hi. So I guess this really does dovetail with what you were just talking about, that political science doesn't have a lot of, or isn't really designed to challenge power structures.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in IR. I would like to go into a doctoral program in IR. And I've noticed even here at the University of Minnesota, which is famous for critical perspectives and
Right.
constructivism in IR, I haven't noticed a lot of serious critical perspectives in my classes. So I guess what I've read personally, I've read Agamben, and that's about it for critical theory.
Yeah.
Where should I start, I guess, if I'm looking for critical perspectives? I don't know if in IR or in political theory generally.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that I mean, I can't speak to sort of the courses that are being taught in IR because I don't know in that level of detail. But there are, you know, I mean, definitely the department is known for its sort of known for sort of championing and sort of developing the constructivist school. So, I mean, I guess Daniela could also answer this question very well, but definitely, I mean, there are works that came out of Minnesota that are interesting to read by Bud Duval, for instance. There are some works that actually some schools in Canada, like UVic, or in the UK, that have interesting perspectives. I just actually reviewed this book called Decolonizing Politics by an IR scholar at Johns Hopkins, Robbie Shilliam, who talks a lot about kind of IR. And it might be an interesting book for you to read. It's kind of short, it's only 150 pages, but it is sort of thinking about every subfield of political science and how they were kind of concerned always with questions of race science and empire, and, you know, how like some of the early sort of figures, you know, kind of figures in the field were kind of narrowly concerned with these problems. But then Shilliam kind of decenters that and starts to think about, well, what about these other figures that are not considered part of IR or comparative politics, but, who speak from the periphery or the margins that, really also speak to kind of core questions of in political theory. A core question is, what is human nature? What does it mean to be human? And, how can we approach that from Immanuel Kant versus like someone like Sylvia Wynter, who's a Kirbian thinker. Similarly, thinking about, in IR, thinking about sort of some of the early figures, and then kind of thinking with social movements for, denuclearization in the Pacific as, as sort of like central thinkers in IR. So I don't know. I mean, I really recommend this book, Decolonizing Politics by Ravi Shilyan. I think that it's a really great way to start thinking of the history of political science and where else we should be looking for different kinds of different sorts of knowledges, I suppose, and different kinds of canons that are in the margins. So yeah.
You have the link of the book in the chat in case you want to check. Yeah. Can I make a question and maybe connect Kelso's question with a more general one? So
sure.
What would be your advice for students thinking about doing a PhD in the future? Because everybody knows that doing a PhD is not easy. Mm-hmm. So how to face that? I mean, how to make the right decision? Not only picking the right place, it's just making the previous decision, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a couple of things, I mean, I was also warned of all of this when I was finally decided to do a PhD. There is a sort of real kind of surplus of PhDs on the market. So the job market is kind of constrained. And that is one of the most difficult things, that you might come out after 6 years and not, and, have, be sort of have stable employment, but be precariously employed. So that's a real concern. And so something to think about, I think, before you sort of launch in. But the other aspect is thinking also about the work that's involved and thinking about the structure of different programs, and really like the key sort of I guess all of the hoops that you need to jump through: the qualifying exams, the proposal, the perspectives, the coursework, the dissertation, and really kind of thinking through whether or not that is the kind of work that you would enjoy, and whether you would enjoy doing that under conditions of sort of, like, I mean, I guess whether you would enjoy doing that by sort of living pretty humbly, right? Living kind of, with UCLA, kind of living when like $20,000 a year or something like that. And so that, it is a kind of sacrifice of many years of your life in your 20s and your 30s. And whether, you want to do that, and you are really committed to kind of pursuing a project, or you have some kind of project and that you want to do that. And I think this is one of those things too, where I would say you can sort of reflect on it, but you don't really have a sense of whether or not, if you're really, I guess what I'm saying is, if you're really unsure, you don't really know until you try it. It's not one of those things where you can kind of sit back and reflect on whether or not I want to do a PhD and whether or not I'm cut out for this life. It's one of those things where you sort of have to embark on the project. And, like many people in my cohort, my graduate cohort, dropped out, especially the political theorist, because of, just because of the kind of rigors of what's involved in graduate training and kind of living in poverty in Los Angeles for many years. And so, I think that, it's one of those things where you might kind of be immersed in it and realize, oh, this is just not for me. I can make, more of an impact in other areas, and I can be much happier. I have other priorities, like I have, a family that I need to look after and so on. So it's one of those things where you kind of embark on, and it's sort of a trial and error process. And it might very well be that you love it so much that you find that you're cut out for it. You want to kind of stick with it till the end, which is great. And, but it takes a lot of perseverance, and it also takes a lot of ingenuity of sort of, navigating through bureaucratic structures and very sort of different personalities, whether it's, faculty members or whoever. So it's a lot of like growing up very quickly with very few resources. So yeah, so that's kind of what I would say. And of course, if sometimes just exploring graduate schools can be an exciting process and can really kind of get you excited about working with people. Yeah, I think that's sort of what I would do. I would talk to graduate students who are in those programs, faculty, sort of, if you're kind of early stage in your decision process or decision-making process of whether to go to grad school. You can talk to faculty at your undergraduate institution, but you're unlikely to sort of have the years of faculty at a different institution. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's probably what I would say.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? No? Professor, maybe some final words? Becky, sorry.
Sorry, I hate to jump in. I want to give students a chance. So you're finishing up this book, and I don't know what the timeline for that is, but what is next?
Right, yeah. Yeah, so that's a great question. And so I have a year off next year working on this book. I got a bunch of fellowships for it. So that's what I'm going to be doing. And then after that, I am sort of thinking about, it's very, very kind of, I only have the broad outlines of this project, so it's very sort of early in its conception, but I want to work on a project on kind of imperialism and reproductive labor, which is sort of how I'm thinking about it. And specifically, I want to think about how, so reproductive labor is a broad conception in feminist theory. And I really, I did a lot of feminist theory as an undergraduate and as a graduate student. And I never really got to engage with some of the core questions that I really was interested in this book on Fanon, which is like the question of really the kind of work that is necessary to reproduce society. And some of this is care work. It's not just sort of, the work of sort of taking care of children and laboring and all that stuff, but just the kind of care work that is involved in reproducing society. And I'm sort of interested in the ways in which in societies that are under imperial rule, how that conception of reproductive labor is impacted by imperial rule. So like I am interested in thinking with like Angela Davis, who talks about reproductive labor as this sort of from the sort of specific position of Black women in the United States. And that to me is really kind of interesting because she's sort of thinking about this question from a very specific nexus. There is a Guyanese a feminist called Sandra Williams, whose work has never been ever unearthed, really, and I'm interested in kind of thinking with her as well. So I really want to return to thinking about feminist theory again, and I just really miss it and really want to think about those questions. Yeah, that's kind of where that would be the next project, I think, the next book project. Yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
It is. So if we don't have more questions, maybe Professor, do you have some final words?
Yeah, sure. So I would say that, for those of you who are interested in kind of pursuing an honors thesis or some larger writing project, like I'm really excited to speak to you about it. I am not around that much next semester or next year, actually, next academic year. But when I return, I'm really, excited and happy to think about that with you, think about those questions. And I guess the other thing is, for those of you pursuing PhDs, definitely in political science or in another discipline in the social sciences, yeah, definitely kind of think through and talk to, faculty members you have about what their graduate school experience was like. It is really, it is a really great sort of, if you love to sort of live the life of the mind, so to speak, right? It is a really gratifying and exciting and sort of worthy of your time. And so I definitely, don't want to discourage people from not pursuing a PhD, but it is sort of not for everybody. And I think getting as much information as you can is really important. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor. And thank you all for your participation. We will be having our next faculty talk in March with Professor James Summers. So more information coming soon. Have a good weekend and goodbye.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
everybody.
Bye.
See you later.
Bye.